Hi guys, it's Laura and we've made it to forms. If you think about it, forms are an integral part of the web. Chapter 7 is over forms and controls used in them. Using a form on a web page is a great way to get information from the user. Logins, emails, product requests, these are all gathered by forms. The company may want to gather multiple types of data from a user, so to do this there are multiple types of controls available within forms. Notice that there are text boxes, radio buttons, and ways to submit information and upload files. Each form control has a name and a value which is sent to the server, so these are name-value pairs. And when the data reaches the server, you have to have a way to identify which piece of information it is and in which order to use it. So that's a great part of the name values. Once the name and the value pairs get to the server, it may use a database, it might use email or other data processing storage tools to make use of the information you've collected from the user. Email addresses can be used for marketing, and once someone has signed up for a marketing list or a mailing list, it means they've invited emails. Other information can be directly related to sales, that means money, and continuing your site. So it's really important to get this information. Languages like PHP, SQL, and others help process the data received by the server. This can create reports, orders, emails back to the user. It does a lot of things. The server returns a page to the user based on the information supplied in the form. Note that this will largely contain HTML and CSS. Some pages can be triggered by a database and be generated on the fly, like Amazon's pages. Using a template and information from the database, the pages can be created as needed. We won't get into that in this course, but I'm giving you a strong basis for working towards it. The server needs to know what the user entered or chose for each different form element. To do this, each form element must have a name and the value the user enters or the value associated with the choice made. The name-value pairs are declared as a name, then equals, and then the value that will be sent to the server when the form is submitted. You have to mark those up. Here is the value of the username section. Usernames and other directly entered text values use a text control on the form. What you see here is what will be sent to the server. If the user entered Fred, then it would be the value of Fred. Forms are set up using a form tag that's wrapped around the entire form, just like tables. Remember to close the form tag at the end of the form. I like to type in the opening and closing tags and then work between them. That way I don't forget to close the tag. The action attribute gives the form a destination or a way of getting that information to the server. This is not always a web address. It can be an email address, a server, a PHP file, and etc. The method attribute tells how the data will be sent to the server. We can use the get and post methods. Using get, the form data is sent as part of the URL, open to the world to see. That's not very secure, but it's great for making a bookmark. Using post, the data is sent as a packet. Neither are encrypted. Keep this in mind. You don't want to ask for credit card information. When you set up a form, you'll need to find an encryption method in addition to what you learn here. Let's look at some types of inputs. The first is text. An input tag is differentiated using the type attribute. Inside the input tag, the type attribute is set to the type of control you're using. In this case, it's text. The name for the name-value pair is an attribute that's declared inside of the input tag. The size attribute used to specify the size of the control. This can also be specified using CSS. And the size given does not restrict the user from adding additional characters. However, it can help indicate how long an entry is expected to be. For example, collecting parts of a state abbreviation, 2 characters compared to an email address. The maximum length is used to limit the number of characters a user can enter. This is helpful again in an example like the state abbreviation. Here's a text box that we saw set up in the last few slides. Let's set up a password input. The password attribute does not mean what is entered is secure. It's not encrypted, remember. It just stops people from being able to read the character when they're looking over your shoulder while the user's entering them. So no shoulder surfing. The font defaults to an obscured type for that input box. But that doesn't mean, if you didn't have a special font, that somebody couldn't get to it. We've looked at text boxes, but they're limited in size. A text area allows for more words, like a comment section. Instead of using an input tag, we use the text area tags, opened and closed. The name attribute is still used. We also use an attribute to set the columns for the width of the text area. After that, we use the rows attribute to set the length of the text area, or the height. The text area shows as a larger text box, and in some browsers will show a resize control down in the bottom right. What about limiting the user to a single selection on a form control? We can do that using a radio button. Radio buttons allow you to pick one of several options. This example shows 3 options. Radio buttons are self-closing tags, and the type attribute is set to radio. Note that the name is the same for all the radio buttons in the group of options. Without the same name for all the radio buttons, they won't group together and the single selection isn't going to happen. It doesn't force it to make one value for the name-value pair. We also use the value attribute with radio buttons. Note that these are different for each option to indicate which option the user selected. Once an option is chosen, there's no way to deselect it. You'd have to select another option in order to change your choice, but it's not a click twice to unselect. Here we have the radio button inputs that were set up earlier. The buttons all show on the same line because nothing in the markup told them to have a line break. That would be a BR. Checkboxes, like radio buttons, are self-closing tags. Checkboxes allow users to select more than one option, unlike the radio buttons. Note the setting of type equals checkbox. Note how these names are the same for each checkbox. Again, this groups the elements together so the checkboxes work as a unit, just like in radio buttons. The value attributes are set as with the radio buttons. Note that these are different for each option, so the server knows which option the user selected, just like with our radio buttons, only this time they can select multiples. If you want to have a checkbox be checked by default, then you would set an attribute in the one checkbox option that you want checked, and the attribute is checked, and the value is checked. It's pretty nice that they made it that simple. Notice the first checkbox is checked and the rest are not. That is the checked attribute that we were just talking about. We can set a drop-down list also. These are selection lists that allow the user to pick one of several options. They're useful where a long list of options are needed but space is limited. Think about country selections. The tag is select, and it wraps around the options in the list for the selection. The options are individually set up, like the checkboxes and radio buttons were, and they're wrapped around the text which will show as the selection item. The name is set to determine what the topic of your selection will be. In this case, it's devices. The value attribute is set for each option tag. These are the values that will show when sent to the server, indicating what the user selected. Seems to be a pattern here. The selected attribute makes an option automatically checked upon page load. This is like the checked attribute used earlier in the checkboxes. This is what the selection menu looks like in one type of a browser. Different browsers will render it differently, but it'll still be a drop-down. Multiple select boxes, like the drop-down, it's a list, but unlike the drop-down select that only allows one selection, the multiple select box allows for more than one selection. Set up much like the select drop-down was, this one uses the size attribute to define the number of options shown in the viewing screen or the viewing window. So the only real change from one to the other is the size attribute. Using a file input box allows your users to send you a file. Again, we're using the input tag, but this time the type is set to file. By default, the type of file will create the ability to upload files. So the type equals file is what sets the ability. Again, we want to set up a name for the server to use. In this case, we're going to use the method of post. We can't send the file via a URL string. Notice that we did not tell it to put a browser nor an upload button using markup, but that's taken care of by the browser when it sees the type of file. Every form needs a way to send the information to the server. Setting up a submit button is the answer to that. The input tag is used and the type is set to submit. This takes care of the button, and the action we set in the form attribute will be what the button does when it's hit. The value is what appears on the button as text. You'll need to specify this so that people will know what to click in order to have the form submit. If you leave value blank, then you'll have a blank button. Notice the submit button has a subscribe as the text on it. The value is set as subscribe, so be sure to make it something that makes sense for the form you're using and for the user to click. Setting up an image button helps make a form more interesting. As long as you have an image to use as the background of the button, you can set it and use that to be the submit button. Use the input tag again. We'll set the attribute this time to type as image. Tell the form where the image is located. It's the source, src. Now we can set the size of the image button, and this can also be done using CSS. And we get a button that has an image. The subscribe is part of the image instead of being what the value was set as. Another way to accomplish an image button is to use the button tag. The button tag wraps around the image you want to set up. Place the image tag that we've learned previously into the button tag. And we get an image that's a button. Labeling form controls allows users to click on the label and trigger the input option on the form. The label tag is wrapped around the text you want to use as a label, and the input that you want is linked to it. This is an example of an implicit labeling. Using explicit labeling means we'll wrap the label tag around only the text of the label. We use an attribute called for and set to the same value as the ID attribute we placed in the input tag when we want to link them together. If this were in a browser, you'd be able to click on the word age and it would highlight the text box because the labels are linked. Sometimes we need to set a form up with groups of information, partially for data grouping visually on the page and for setting up the way the CSS on a specific group or area of the form will look. Using the field set tag, you wrap it around the controls on the page to delineate an area you want to group together, much like a div tag for HTML. A legend is used to wrap around the text that will be used as a caption or a title for a certain area. Note the legend is contract details and is connected to the field set around the email, mobile, and telephone fields. Form validation is used with browsers that are newer. JavaScript is needed and is defaulted into this, so you won't have to use a lot of script to make it work. Older browsers will not do this, though. The attribute required is used to make sure users enter a value. This is a validation aspect and uses a built-in JavaScript component that's in newer browsers. If the required field is left blank, the browser will pop up a complaint about it. Hey, this is required. Forms are used to collect information from users. Information is sent to the server in name-value pairs. A text form control is given a name, and the text the user enters will be paired with that name as the value. HTML5 has introduced some form elements that make elements easier to use. These only work with newer browsers. We'll use forms more in this class. Please remember you can look for more information in the book and online. Be sure with online advice that it's newer and standards compliant, not old school. Have a great week, and I'll talk to you all later.